So I don't usually make it my business to hang out in garages, but there's an event at the end of the month that actually might get me to do it even without meeting a secret source. The Garage Racing National Championships are back Saturday, February 22nd in Arlington's National Landing. What started as a quirky garage race in 2012 has since grown into a national competition drawing riders from 7 states and DC to compete underground. And the best part, it is free to watch. The Garage Racing National Championships, Saturday, February 22nd from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., free for spectators. RSVPs encouraged at nationallanding.org/racing. See you underground. Today on CityCast DC, one side effect of Donald Trump's federal downsizing is that there are going to be a lot of high-profile federal buildings hitting the market and ready for redevelopment. One cluster of them sits just south of the mall on Independence Avenue. It stretches down towards the Wharf. This could be a whole new neighborhood in a choice location. What could it look like? And what will it take to actually make it happen? The Washington Post's Aaron Wiener has been covering the story. He's here to explain. Today is Thursday, February 13th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Mike. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for coming, man.
My pleasure.
So the federal government famously wants to get rid of a lot of stuff, including a lot of real estate, which is what you have written about recently. And this is one thing where the city is not freaking out about these plans. In fact, they see some potential there. There are a whole bunch of federal buildings that you wrote about that were just south of the mall off Independence, and the government wants to de-accession them. And there's talk that this could lead to a whole new neighborhood for DC as that gets redeveloped. Can you sort of explain exactly where these buildings are and what they are?
Broadly speaking, just to zoom out for a second, the GSA, the General Services Administration, which manages real estate for the federal government, is talking about getting rid of up to 50% of its property under the new Trump administration. Obviously, a lot of that property is in DC, and particularly concentrated around downtown and near the National Mall. And so there are lots of things that are making people in DC nervous about this new administration right now. But one area where city leaders see a lot of opportunity is this particular area of federal buildings in the southwest quadrant, just south of the National Mall, in what's kind of a dead zone right now outside of work hours between the mall, which has a lot of life, and the Wharf down on the Potomac Riverfront, which has a lot of life. And in between, the city is sort of salivating at the opportunity to convert some of these hulking, old, obsolete federal buildings into something new and livelier.
So point this out to me. You're driving down Independence Avenue nowadays, and this is, if you're heading towards the Capitol, this would be on your right. And, one of them is the old engraving and printing building. There's a couple others. What does it look like now if somebody wanted to go look at it?
Let's say you're taking that drive. You're coming from 14th Street, from the Washington Monument. You're going to pass the Department of Agriculture South building, which is 2 whole blocks long. Then you're going to pass the Forrestal building of the Department of Energy, which is also 2 blocks long and kind of sits up above the street with 10th Street going under it in what they must have thought was cool 50 or 60 years ago and doesn't look so cool anymore.
That's L'Enfant Plaza.
Yeah, exactly. Right. L'Enfant Plaza is, I think everyone who has lived in DC for a while has had the experience of getting out of the metro there and spinning around in circles and trying to figure out where you are, because there's just not a sense of place around there. It's just these big anonymous federal structures. And so there are actually these renderings that were put together by an architecture firm that sort of picture, what if this whole area were re-envisioned? What if some of it were turned into park and plaza space and residences and civic and entertainment uses, but it were deliberately planned as a way to connect the mall down to the Wharf and kind of keep continuous street life for that whole stretch.
So what exact buildings are they talking about getting rid of?
Right. So the 2 that I mentioned with the Department of Agriculture South building and the Forrestal complex at the Department of Energy. There's also the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. There's the Sidney Yates building, the Wright buildings that are part of the Transportation Department that are a little farther to the east. There are a number of others that the federal government is eyeing, but those are some of the ones that seem to present the greatest opportunity to the city.
Now, some of these are grand buildings, like that Department of Agriculture building. I don't know whether they are subject to historic preservation or anything, but is the idea that if DC gets domain and can redevelop this area, they would knock these buildings down and put something else up? I can't imagine wanting to live in like the Department of that Forrestal building, which is a brutalist, monstrosity.
So you raised about a half dozen of the challenges here. It's not an easy or straightforward process. So yes, as you mentioned, some of them are subject to historic preservation. That adds just a wrinkle to any redevelopment plans. Some of them offer opportunities for straightforward conversion to uses like residential or hotel, but some of them really don't because they're just these massive footprints, and any building that is too wide and deep just doesn't have enough interior light to chop it up into apartments and give every one of them windows. So some of the buildings would actually need to be torn down if they're going to be converted into anything. Some of them could be converted more simply, but it's not likely that DC would be given domain over them. More likely, DC would dictate the land use, but private developers would be taking them over. And It would be a very complex process to try to do any sort of, comprehensive redevelopment that has a sense of cohesion. It would require a degree of coordination between DC and the federal government that we haven't always seen a lot of.
Well, wait. So what is stopping the federal government from just selling it to the highest bidder? And why is the city government involved at all? I mean, I like the idea of creating a new neighborhood, but where does the local government have the leverage to do that? Couldn't they just sell it to someone who wants to start, a steel mill or something?
They could. The challenge is a lot of these buildings are not worth that much on the real estate market right now because nobody is paying a lot of money for office buildings. The only area where developers see opportunity in existing office buildings, these kind of trophy buildings, the top class buildings, there's just not a lot of demand for other ones right now. And so it's unlikely that a developer is going to really be paying top dollar for a building that is big and old and obsolete and would just need to be torn down. There's some potential for a process that DC could help smooth the path for, basically, that would allow it to be some sort of, more of a master developer process, or at least something where DC is dictating the land uses in such a way that it actually offers greater possibilities for buyers.
Meaning like they'll give people some sort of financial break for buying these doomed buildings, but in exchange for that, they get to sort of prod and push in the development so that it creates the sort of new neighborhood that they're dreaming about.
Yeah, that's one possibility. I mean, DC is already offering all kinds of tax breaks for conversions, and these would presumably apply too. But we're too early in the process to know any of that, really. I mean, at this point, the city is hoping that the federal government will put these buildings on its surplus list to get rid of them, and then the process can really begin for what happens next.
In times like these, times that feel kind of dark, I constantly find myself leaning into art and history for inspiration. The arts can provide solace from the seemingly constant barrage of bad news, and history can give us hope and light and show us a path forward. That's why this month, I can't wait to see Fuente Ovejuna at the Gala Theater. Fuente Ovejuna tells the story of a town where women lead an uprising against a tyrant, taking up arms and confronting the authorities. It's one of Spain's most famous plays by the legendary Lope de Vega, and it's headed at Gala by award-winning director Jose Luis Arellano. Witness the people rise up against oppression. The show is in Spanish with English surtitles and runs February 6th through March 2nd. Get more information and tickets at galatheater.org. That's galatheater.org. CityCast is made possible by the Peabody Institute of the Johns Hopkins University, celebrating 1 year of performances at the university's Bloomberg Center, located at 555 Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. This spring, immerse yourself in the vibrant offerings at D.C.'s newest venue for music and dance. Featuring a full season of free performances, experience a dynamic range of events, including orchestral, jazz, and chamber music, all presented by esteemed Peabody faculty, students, alumni, and special guests. Highlights of the season include Songs from Inside on February 14th, a chamber choral performance highlighting the experiences of incarcerated writers in history and the present, and Load Bang on April 30th, a music chamber ensemble performing works by Peabody composition faculty, Guggenheim Fellows, and Pulitzer Prize finalist Felipe Lara. While all events are free, tickets are required for entry. Explore the full performance schedule, find out more details, and reserve your tickets at washingtondc.jhu.edu.
So if we're talking about building a new neighborhood, this is like a huge lift. I love the talk of something that connects the mall to the wharf, because there's sort of, it's not that far, but there's the psychological barrier of that freeway, and it doesn't seem like walking distance, even though it very much is. But has anybody talked about what exactly this would look like? Have somebody come up with fantasy renderings so we can get a sense of what they're imagining?
Yeah. So there was this really quite noteworthy meeting that happened at the Department of Agriculture South Building, one of the ones they're considering getting rid of the Public Buildings Reform Board, which was this congressionally created board that makes recommendations to the federal government about what property to get rid of, basically. And you had there on stage former DC Mayor Anthony Williams, current DC Planning Director Anita Cozart, together with Trump's new director of the Public Buildings Service, which oversees federal real estate, and Trump's old director of the Public Buildings Service from his first term, and Democratic and Republican lawmakers. It was this group of people that you don't often see getting together and speaking from the same playbook. And they were, and that was kind of remarkable in its own right, and all singing each other's praises. But they also invited an architect to present these renderings of what the area could look like. Again, it's all hypothetical at this point, but what he imagined were new connections that would restore the street grid. So Maryland and Virginia avenues, which are cut off right now, would be continued. There would be like a green promenade that would go along 10th Street, where there's currently this imposing L'Enfant Plaza situation. It would be an actual welcoming situation that would kind of usher people down toward the waterfront. It provided this sort of tantalizing vision for what things could look like.
Were there apartment buildings, row houses? What?
No row houses, but there were, apartments and some civic uses. It didn't get super specific on exactly what the uses would be. The idea is that there would be some sort of institutional stuff and probably some combination of residential and office and retail.
And so you got the sense in this room, you have, Trump appointees, city officials, Democratic, Republican lawmakers, and they're all sort of for this idea. I know there's no specifics yet. So
yeah, exactly. It's this unusual alignment, right? Republicans in the federal government have long wanted to shrink the government. And this idea that the Trump administration could get rid of a lot of federal property appeals to them. DC would love to get more control over this area, particularly this area of Southwest. And so DC sees it as a win too. And then there's the third potential win here, which is for federal workers, a lot of whom are in these obsolete buildings right now. And officials see an opportunity for them to move out of these places that are totally outdated and dysfunctional and into newer, better leased offices rather than ones owned by the federal government.
Although these days they seem to want to move them even further out of the buildings.
Right. This is where we have to say that there are huge caveats to all of this. In any area where DC sees an upside could be just swamped by all the potential downside of the other actions the administration is taking that could gut the federal workforce. So there are a lot of factors in this equation. We don't really know how it's going to shake out.
Let's pause on that for a second. Is anyone against this? Is anybody no, we've got to maintain the status quo?
I have not heard anyone say that they love these buildings and want them to remain forever.
I mean, brutalism has its fans, but...
Yeah, but there are probably some people who would love to see new brutalist structures built there, but I think no one would defend these buildings specifically, especially because they're costing the government a ton of money to keep up. I mean, the maintenance costs are astronomical, and for what exactly?
But so I got to ask, it's sort of hard to ignore the politics of the moment. When DC puts its shoulder into a big, ambitious new plan to, create a new neighborhood, spur housing, et cetera, there is usually some kind of equity component, some sort of mandate around affordable housing and so on. Given the Trump administration's views, that might not be so popular. Who would, if in this process, if it gets to where the city wants it, does that mean the federal government, meaning the Trump administration, no longer wouldn't get any more say than they would on any other project? Or are they going to continue to be able to push for their priorities?
I think they probably would. I mean, it's probably a misnomer to say the city would get it. The city would kind of help shepherd the process, but it would be the federal government turning this property over to private developers to make this happen. And so if DC wanted to insert into that sales agreement any provisions requiring affordable housing or anything else that the administration considered objectionable, that might be harder. I will say there was no mention of affordable housing in the presentation.
You cover this stuff. Let's say everyone's on board, there's no political headaches, et cetera. We're talking about a fairly substantial chunk of downtown DC. How long would it take to transform it into this other thing that they're talking about?
I don't think anyone could give you a realistic time frame at this point. I mean,
Well, give me an unrealistic one.
yeah. I mean, it would probably take years just in the negotiations phase. It takes a while for the Public Buildings Reform Board. I believe is making its next recommendations at the end of the year. Then GSA has to consider what to do with all of this. That process alone usually takes a couple of years. And then they have to actually put it out to bid. And then, then there's the whole pre-development, financing, developments. I mean, it would be, I imagine, years before ground is broken and then many more years until it's actually done.
What if they promised to call it Trump Town? Would it move faster?
Yeah, then it would be done in 2 weeks.
For a lot of people, who think about the cityscape of Washington, the idea of like knitting the Southwest waterfront back into the city that it has been severed from is an incredibly appealing thing. People have gotten their hopes up about stuff in the past. Is this a thing you think is actually going to happen?
I have learned, even just from the event of the last few weeks, that I shouldn't be in the business of making predictions. I think that a lot of people who are involved in this see a greater opportunity for collaboration between the federal and local governments to make this happen than they've seen in a long time, even though they are admittedly very strange bedfellows right now.
Hey, Aaron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mike.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.